What is up, everybody? I'm back here again today with a video on Proclus and his take on evil. So, let's start out by thinking about evil. Evil is not good. I think everybody's going to accept that. But what exactly is it? Well, for Proclus, following Plotinus and going all the way back into the Platonic tradition, we can start to think about evil in terms of a privation. Now, to see this, think about evil. Think about a disease, or think about an evil act of the will, or think about just a bad item. So we can start with this computer. If this computer wasn't working, we would call it a bad computer. Okay, and it's bad, why? It's bad insofar as it doesn't perform a function, or it lacks something that it should have. Same thing with blindness. So if someone is blind, we say that blindness is bad precisely because blindness is lacking the proper function of sight. And the same thing seems to be true of evil acts of the will. We say that acts of the will are evil because they aren't a good act. So good and evil are interrelated for Proclus. Proclus thinks that, in fact, evil is parasitic on the good. It's not anything in and of itself. It always is in relation to some good. And this is why he says in chapter 9, lines 4 through 6, that evil cannot pervade an entire thing. In order to be at all, things must, in sense, be some good. And so evil is thus always going to be mixed with the good. Let me spell this out a little bit more. So what Proclus is essentially saying is that you can never have evil on its own. It's always in relation to some good, okay? And this is because of an assumption he's making that is latent in a huge tenet in Neoplatonic metaphysics. And that assumption is that in order to be at all, so in order for this computer to be, in order for me to be at all, things must in some sense be unified. Okay, this is Proclus's first proposition in the Elements of Theology. Go check out my video on it. But in order to be at all, things must be unified. They must be a one. Now, one, or unity, for Proclus and the scholastics and pretty much all of ancient philosophy, one or unity is convertible with being and convertible with goodness. So one, being, and good are all convertible with each other. They're all aspects of reality that are talking about the same thing being in different modes. So when we say that in order to be at all, this computer has to be one or unified, it also, in order to be at all, has to be good. So since goodness pervades an entire feature of a thing, evil, or lack of goodness, is thus going to be it's going to be nothing. It's not, well, technically it's going to be a lack, but if we're using our language a bit casually, it's going to be nothing. Okay, so he goes on to say, Proclus goes on to say in the next chapter, lines 18 through 19, that all things then are good in that there is no evil unadorned and unmixed. So let's put this kind of into an argument here. So we can say that evil is not good, but what is good is being. So therefore evil is not being. And we can get kind of more precise here and make some distinctions between non-being, not being, and lack of being, and also nothing. And so this will become a little bit more clear. But really, if you want to be super precise, you have to say that evil is in fact a lack of being. Okay? And that's what I would go with. I think you can run into some problems, and I'm just going on a little tangent here, because in Neoplatonism, matter is technically non-being. So if you identify matter and with non-being, and you say that evil is non-being, then you run into a problem that Plotinus faces, which I'm about to get to. So really, I think that you should say, following Proclus in chapter 51 of his Doctrine on Evil, his treatise on evils, so this is chapter 51, lines 1 through 8, Proclus says that what is altogether evil is privation or lack of goodness. Okay, so again, that just follows from my argument where you have, again, being is, or evil is not good, and what is good is being, And so evil would then not be being. But again, it's going to be a lack of being rather than pure non-being. So, all right, let's get into this criticism of Plotinus here. So Plotinus in Aeneid 1.8, he lays out this theory as well, and he approaches it from a kind of different point of view. So Plotinus approaches it from the view of the one, and he's got a little paradox that Augustine also takes up in his Confessions. And the paradox seems to be this, okay? So if all things come from the one, or God, and evil is some sort of thing, then it would have to come from the one. But the one is good, and so then evil would be good. And that's because the one, all of its effects, so like its created order, pervade all of the created order. So the one, as goodness, would create everything to be good, yet evil is not good, so we get into this paradox here. So how can the one create this thing, evil, that's not good at all? And so this is really what Augustine is struggling with in his Confessions. He's like, I don't understand, how could God create something, if God is all good, how could God create something like evil? And the answer comes with Augustine reading Plotinus. And Plotinus solves this paradox with this privation theory. And he essentially goes the same way as Proclus, where the one does not create evil. God does not create evil because evil is a lack of being. It's not a thing. It's not a substance. And so God therefore doesn't create it. It's a lack of. It's a privation. It doesn't have any ontological positivity to it. But Plotinus goes a bit further here. And Plotinus actually identifies evil with matter. And that's a whole other complex conversation, but Plotinus identifies evil and matter. And Proclus points out that this is kind of incoherent. So this is really in chapters 31 and 32 of Proclus's treatise on evils. But essentially what Proclus does is he responds to Plotinus by basically giving two arguments. So he rejects the claim that matter is evil, and he rejects the claim that matter and evil are necessary features of reality. So Plotinus, I forgot to add that Plotinus actually thinks that matter and evil are the same and that they are necessary. Okay, so Proclus will reject all this. And he targets Plotinus in two ways. So he criticizes the identification of evil and matter, and he argues that you can't identify evil with necessity. So, Proclus will say, to quote him, in chapter 31, lines 5 through 9 and 16 through 18, that, quote, if matter is evil, one of two things is necessary, either to make the good the cause of evil, or to make two principles of beings. Since matter is from the principle, even this has its entrance into being from the good, nor is evil from the good. Thus, the good will be evil as the cause of evil, but evil will be the good as from the good. Evil will be good as from the good. So this is quite a complex chunk of text here. But basically, he's packing a bunch of arguments into this. So he says this, essentially. If you identify matter with evil, as Plotinus does, and matter is some sort of thing that makes up the world, even if it's privation, and again, we're getting into some complex areas with Plotinus here, but if you identify matter and evil, since the good creates matter, then the good would also create evil, and you don't solve the original paradox that Plotinus set out to solve in the first place. Or, if you don't want to do that, you have to have some sort of evil principle that creates matter and evil, and that is what Manichaeanism is, which is what Augustine was struggling with. And so both of those options are absurd, because you don't want the good to create evil, and you don't want to have two principles of beings, or else for the Platonists you'd have to go beyond that and have another principle prior to that. And so, Proclus is like, well, we can't do this. So what we have to do then is we have to not identify evil and matter. And this seems to follow from the Platonic principles. So I think that Proclus here is correct. And so he goes on in chapter 32 to discuss this notion of necessity. And this is pretty interesting here. He says that if matter is necessary for the all, meaning the totality of all things, and the cosmos would not be this all-great and blessed God if matter were absent, then how can the nature of evil still be referred to this? For evil is one thing and the necessary another, and the latter is such that the universe could not be without it, but the former is the privation of being. So again here, he seems to be restating something he said above, where if matter is necessary for the creation of the world, then we run into a problem. So for the Neoplatonists and some Christians like Dionysius and John Scotus Erigena, the world is a theophany, meaning it's a manifestation of God. So God is transcendent to the world, but also manifested in the created order. And so if you have a created order that's made up of matter and is therefore evil, you would have God manifested in this created order as evil. And that's just contrary to the doctrine of God as the good. So that can't happen. And so Proclus seems to point out here that you can't have matter, evil, and necessity all be one, or else you run into these absurdities with your doctrine of the one. So, what else does Proclus say about evil? Well, again, we've covered the grounds of his criticism of Plotinus, and we have also covered his doctrine of evil as a privation or a lack of being, which just follows from the identification of being, oneness, and goodness, and the fact that being is parasitic on the good. So if you accept these convertibility of being, goodness, and oneness, and you accept that evil is always parasitic or in relation to some good, then you can get to this notion of evil as a lack of being. So, where does he go from here? Well, this is actually quite an interesting move that he makes. So, he points out in chapters 23 and 24 that evil is going to apply to only humans and natural bodies. And this is really where things start to get pretty controversial. So, Dionysius, following Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Christian philosopher, he thinks that evil extends to all reality, the entire totality of reality. Proclus doesn't. Proclus doesn't think that angels, demons, gods, or heroes are capable of evil. Now, I have a hunch that this has to do with his idea of the soul fully descending in the case of humans, whereas the soul doesn't fully descend in the case of angels, demons, heroes, and gods. And so if the soul fully descends, which it does only in the case of humans, then it seems like humans are going to be the only ones that can struggle with poor decision making. Let me spell that out a bit more. So Proclus says in chapters 23, 24, and again in 27, that essentially evil in terms of human nature is a failure to cognitively ascend to the one. What does this mean? Well, Proclus thinks that evil in terms of humans is a failure to pursue their proper goods, their proper role in the celestial hierarchy, their proper role in worshiping the one. So what that essentially means is that when I make a poor act of the will and I pursue some good that is really not good for me, I am failing to pursue my own good, which is a manifestation of the good or the one. And Proclus thinks that this is possible only because of our souls being fully descended into our bodies, whereas for angels and heroes that's not the case. And so it seems like then you would only have evil in terms of humans, and of course in animals, because their soul is also going to be, I think, fully descended, but I could be wrong on that. So let me sum that up again. Proclus thinks that, and this is in chapters 23 and 24, Proclus thinks that evil for humans is found in their failing to intellectually ascend to the One. Evil is just a failure of proper cognition. It's a failure to make the proper choices in ordering my own goodness toward the One. So for instance, if I choose to go out and drink a ton of alcohol and get drunk, that would be me failing to use my cognition to intellectually ascend to contemplating the One. And so that action would be evil, because I have violated my proper role, my proper nature as an intellectual being, and that proper nature is to use my cognition to intellectually contemplate the One. And so, again, Proclus thinks that this only applies to humans because our soul is fully descended, whereas it doesn't apply to heroes, gods, angels, or demons. And this is actually pretty interesting, because there seems to be some inconsistencies there. And Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, actually is going to go much beyond Proclus and apply this Procline theory of evil to angels, demons, and so forth. Now, the final question, which is probably the most controversial here, is, of course, this. What causes evil? So this is really, really tricky, because as we've pointed out, evil is a privation, or a lack of being. And as a lack of being, it's not a thing, it's not a substance, it doesn't have any ontological positivity to it. It's not something that you can grasp, something that you can hold on to. It's just a pure lack of what's there, what's supposed to be there. And so, because it's a lack of what's supposed to be there, it can't be caused in the same sense. I can't go out and create evil. I can't go out and make evil in the sense of making a chair, because it's not a thing. But and then in another sense, evil can be caused because you can have two goods clashing. So for instance, if an animal eats another animal, the evil or of death, or the lack of one of the animal's lives, is going to be caused. And so Proclus struggles to figure out how exactly we can talk about evil being caused. And he points out in chapter 50, line 30, that evil is something that is seemingly unintelligible or absurd. And the reason why is because evil, as a lack of being, can't be caused because it isn't a substance. But on the other hand, it is indirectly brought about by various goods. And so Proclus's conclusion is that what evil really is, what it means to cause evil, so what it means to cause evil, what it means to talk about evil being caused, is to talk about different goods clashing with each other, and evil being the failure to, let's say, the failure of one good to not win out, but to be. And so, evil, as a lack of being, is caused by improper reversion to the One. It's not caused by something positive, or it's not something positive or some being, and as such can't be caused. But what it is it's caused by the clash of two competing goods, and one good failing to exercise enough causal power to properly be. And if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, then you're not alone, because I find this the most difficult part of Proclus's treatment of evil, because it seems that human desires and animal desires in the natural world can in fact cause evils to be. But again, Proclus is struggling to answer this, and he seems to answer it by saying that the cause of evil is just improper action. Okay? And because of that, he goes on to hint that evil is unintelligible. So I guess we could definitely raise some objections to this. There are a lot of things to raise here, whether or not that's a coherent response, whether or not it is in fact right to say that evil is absurd or unintelligible, whether it's right to say that it's uncaused. I think there's a bit of an ambiguity going on here in the word cause, which is causing some problems, no pun intended. But that's something to think about, because you have to keep in mind that all of this entire doctrine is going to be laden with language that Neoplatonists use, which doesn't have the same meaning that we do. So when Proclus is talking about a cause, he is in fact talking about something that is a sustaining cause, in one sense. In another sense, he's definitely talking about a making to be. He's also talking about a proceeding from the one and a reverting to the one. So I think in order to fully flesh out Proclus's answer to what causes evil, really you would have to do a deep dive into what exactly he means when he talks about causation there. So, that's a topic for another time, but it's worth thinking about. And with that, there's just a very brief introduction and take on Proclus's theory of evil. And again, if you want more, you can look at his treatise on evil and his treatise on providence. But realize that he's reacting against Plotinus, and he is going to be kind of taken up and developed by Pseudo-Dionysius.